How's it going, people? It's Anton Jackson. I just finished watching Season 3, Episode 5 of Better Call Saul. This was a really good episode, a pretty interesting one. I'm really excited to review, analyze, and talk about it. So this episode opens up with a pretty mysterious opening. We kind of wonder what's going on initially when the camera pans out to the lawnmower mowing the lawn. Initially, I wasn't sure if this was in the present because of the blue hue I noticed in the on the camera lens. But initially, I realized that this was a flashback. Primarily, in addition to being indicated by the blue hint of the camera lens, we also see that Chuck and Jimmy are going about things in a friendly and jovial manner. It definitely would be peculiar to think that this was happening in the present day based on the most recent court hearing we saw in the previous episode. But we learn pretty quickly that this is a flashback, not too far back in the past, but most likely a few years in the past. This is a fairly long intro, but the long story short of this premise is Chuck and Rebecca, his ex-wife, have recently divorced. And we noticed that Chuck is taking down all the electrical appliances in his house. And this, we realize, is because Rebecca's coming over to eat a meal with Jimmy and Chuck. But Chuck is very adamant about not telling Rebecca, his ex-wife, about his medical condition, to his hypersensitivity of electricity. And a long scene ensues where Rebecca eventually pulls out her cell phone, and in a sort of a frantic effort, Chuck eventually throws the cell phone out of her hand. And this is obviously very odd to Rebecca, and she's kind of taken aback by why he did this. And she sees this as quite a rude gesture without any context of the situation. And Jimmy implores Chuck to tell Rebecca about his condition, but Chuck is very adamant and refuses to tell Rebecca about this medical condition of his. And initially we kind of wonder as the audience why he's so stubborn and so strict to the fact that he does not want Rebecca to know. But towards the end of the episode, we realize why this scene was put at the beginning of the episode, and we realize the importance of this scene. Just a couple of side notes about this scene. I thought it was pretty interesting, and that the excuse Chuck makes for why his power is out when he's lying to Rebecca about a mix-up in the billing information is eerily similar to the ploy which Jimmy enacted against Chuck in, involving the switching of numbers. So I thought that was just kind of a very interesting callback to that situation. And it's not really explicitly stated whether or not Jimmy came up with that story for the con, or if that was Chuck's story. So that's kind of interesting, because as we know in the present day, Jimmy enacted a con which involves switching numbers as well. So it would be kind of odd, and almost it would be a great deal of irony if initially the number switching story originated from Chuck. And additionally, I thought what the scene really reminded me about was the relationship between Jimmy and Chuck. In a sense, this relationship between Jimmy and Chuck somewhat reminds me of the relationship between Walt and Hank in Breaking Bad. These two characters were truly good friends, I believe, but once the revelation of the moral corruption was revealed of one character, in this case Jimmy and Walt, the other characters, Hank and Chuck, just couldn't stand for it. Hank and Chuck's moral convictions superseded their love for their brother respectively. And as fans and as people watching the show, I can speak for myself in saying I rooted for their relationships to continue. But at the end of the day, these people are strong characters with strong moral convictions, and sometimes love for the law supersedes love for family. So unlike the previous episode that emphasized primarily the plot of Gus and Mike, this episode concentrated solely on the law aspect of Better Call Saul. The cartel and Mike and that subplot of Better Call Saul isn't mentioned at all in this episode. This is completely centered on the law. All in all, I thought this episode was a little bit slow moving. It definitely wasn't as exciting as the last episode, but this definitely was a much needed episode in Better Call Saul. It was definitely an episode needed to drive the plot forward and to finally culminate in more or less the ending of this plot in Better Call Saul. Towards the end of the episode, we can kind of see how this plot is going to most likely unravel in the end. Act 1 opens up with Jimmy at the veterinarian office, and we can probably infer from the previous episodes of Better Call Saul that he's at the same veterinarian's office who has collaborated with Mike on various ventures, and this is confirmed after he brings the goldfish to the office. I thought that was a pretty interesting scene when we see this vet truly showing a lot of passion for the animal. He seems to almost care about animals more than he cares about human beings. That's just kind of my interpretation, but I thought it was actually a pretty cool scene to see him have such passion and care so much about the life of this goldfish. When he's visiting the vet, he's there to visit the vet to inquire of his services in the same way Mike was. He was looking for someone with sticky fingers, very sticky fingers, someone who could do a job for him and do it right. And I wasn't sure what Jimmy was talking about, but when this revelation is finally revealed in this episode, it's a pretty cool callback to Breaking Bad, and I was really excited to see the character that was revived in this episode. In the following scene, we see Kim discussing the pending bar case with Paige and Kevin from Mesa Verde. This scene was provided to us online by AMC beforehand, but just to clarify, she basically tells Paige and Kevin of the pending litigation against an associate of her, Jimmy McGill, and how this might affect the Mesa Verde clients moving forward. Kevin seems, fairly dismissive of this and doesn't seem to worry about it. Paige is a little more hesitant, but Kim more or less reassures both of them that there shouldn't be any problem moving forward. The final scene in Act 1 involves Chuck and Howard discussing the pending testimony of Chuck in a court during the bar association trial. It's revealed to us that there is a large amount of foreshadowing in this scene when Howard tells Chuck that he may not need to testify and more or less should not testify due to Chuck's precarious mental state. But Chuck reaffirms to Howard that he's fine and that he won't have a problem testifying. And the reason why Howard seems so concerned about Chuck's testimony is that this case going to trial has impacted other clients at HHM. And Howard indicates to Chuck that they've already lost a client because of this case. But Chuck is pretty dismissive of this notion. He is truly someone who values the law above all else. It's more important to money than him. It's more important to the reputation of the firm. He is absolutely concerned and passionate about making sure Jimmy is disbarred because of the actions which he enacted against Chuck. The very telling quote at the end of this act before the scene cuts is when Chuck says to Howard, "Let justice be done though the heavens fall." So this is basically indicating that Chuck is very adamant that justice be done regardless of the consequences. The second act opens with the beginning proceedings of the trial for Jimmy's potential disbarment. We initially see Howard's testimony. Following Howard's statement, we're prepared for Chuck to give his testimony to the court. We see during the scene that Jimmy is stalling for time. He asked Francesca, who's in the courtroom, about a flight which we're not sure who he's talking about someone's flight being delayed, but that is eventually revealed to us. And additionally, at the end of the scene, we see an amazing Breaking Bad character revival of Huel Babineau, who Jimmy acquired the services of through the vet. When we see Chuck entering the courthouse, we see that he, unbeknownst to him, bumps into Huel, who he just assumes is a bystander. This scene definitely reminded me of Breaking Bad when Saul Goodman used Huel to bump into Jesse to lift the Rice and cigarette from Jesse's coat pocket, as well as taking the marijuana from Jesse's pocket when he's going to move to Alaska. However, it's not revealed to us what exactly he put in his pocket or what he took from Chuck, but the actions of Huel are revealed to us at the end of the episode. Act 3 opens with Chuck's testimony. It's a pretty interesting scene. We get to see the attorney representing the New Mexico Bar Association ask Chuck about his illness, and I think this is to dismiss the fact that Kim and Jimmy are trying to accentuate his illness as a mental health concern, as a result diminishing the validity of the recording from which Chuck obtained from Jimmy. During the scene, we see that the person whose flight Jimmy was stalling for time for was in fact Rebecca. Rebecca comes into the courtroom, and during a 15-minute recess, we find Chuck is pretty disturbed by seeing Rebecca. To this point, Chuck has not told Rebecca about his condition to his hypersensitivity to electricity, but if she's in the courtroom, then it'll have to be revealed to her. And we can definitely recall back to the beginning of the episode during the flashback that Chuck was very adamant about not telling Rebecca about his illness. I wasn't sure why he was so concerned about her not being aware of his sensitivity, but we find out that this is a very important part of Kim and Jimmy's plan, and we start to realize why the writers decided to have this flashback to the conversation he has with Rebecca at the beginning of the episode during the cold opening. During this scene, we also realize why Jimmy employed Mike in the previous episode to take pictures of Chuck's house, and we realized that Jimmy did this so he could send the pictures to Rebecca to show evidence of how sick Chuck really was mentally because of his illness. The fourth and final act in this episode is an important one. We learn what the rhyme and reason is behind Jimmy and Kim's plan is against Chuck. To this point during Chuck's testimony, he's been very calm and collected. He's been able to keep calm during this testimony, and he has more or less dodged every trick that Jimmy's had for him. I believe the point of Jimmy and Kim's plan is to note the potential mental inadequacies of Chuck based on his odd mental illness and his hypersensitivity to electricity, and additionally to prove a personal vendetta of Chuck towards Jimmy, as Jimmy indicates in a previous scene by stating that Chuck hates Jimmy. And this would make the tape recorded under inadmissible pretense. The point of this plan is to prove the mental state of Chuck is not normal, and to also prove the vendetta of Chuck against Jimmy, to dismiss the validity of the tape as evidence to disbar Jimmy. And at the end of the episode, we are revealed to the fact that when Huel bumped into Chuck, he put a battery in his pocket. Jimmy proceeds to ask him a bunch of questions, more or less indicating that this sensitivity is entirely in his head, and he only notices the sensitivity to electricity when he sees the battery or the electrical fields present. However, when the battery was placed on him, unbeknownst to Chuck, he was interacting perfectly normally. And this indicates that Jimmy is trying to prove that Chuck's illness is more of a mental illness than a physical illness. If this truly was a physical illness, Jimmy is trying to prove that he would know that the battery was on him. His body would be able to sense the battery on his person, and he would start to cramp up and act as if he was hurting when he sees the battery present. And this scene reminded me of when Chuck was in the hospital and the doctor turned on the electrical field on the bed unbeknownst to Chuck, and Chuck began to proceed in his conversation not aware that there was an electrical field around him. And I think this plan is to indicate that Chuck's illness is more of a mental illness than a physical illness. The final scene in this act is a long, rambling monologue by Chuck, where he recalls previous conjectures of the past that have nothing to do with the case presented at the bar testimony. He talks about scenes that we saw in previous seasons of Better Call Saul, such as Jimmy stealing the money from the cash register at the convenience store, or the billboard ploy, which he did in season 1. These are things that are just explain a personal vendetta of Chuck against Jimmy, and he really has no proof of any of this. His long rambling monologue really brings into question his mental state, and it looks like Jimmy and Kim's long plan eventually worked. This scene definitely indicates a theme which I've seen throughout the course of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and that theme is of main characters not being able to control their emotions. I mentioned this in previous reviews of previous episodes, but characters like Walter White, their downfall came from him not being able to control his emotions. When Jesse enacted the plan to make it seem as though he was going to burn Walt's money, he initially just ran out the door. He didn't really stop and think about the plausibility of Jesse burning his money, but he just acted based on solely his emotions. And as human beings, I feel like we really we're naturally inclined to be emotional, but this can really lead to our downfall. This is indicated by Walt, Jimmy, and Chuck in this instance, of people's emotions getting the best of them and not being able to control their emotions when the situation calls for it. If Chuck had just been calm in the situation and bit his tongue and just sat there, he didn't have to say anything. He could just sat there on the witness stand and said nothing. But his emotions got the best of him, and it looks like this is going to eventually lead to the failure of his plan to get Jimmy disbarred. As I said, this episode was pretty good. It wasn't the most exciting episode, especially when it was juxtaposed to the previous episode. But all in all, I thought this was definitely an episode that the season needed. This plot needed to finally be resolved, and it looks like Jimmy is more or less going to get off the hook based on Chuck's testimony. And it looks like moving forward, Jimmy is gonna move forward with his life, and Chuck will move forward with his life. The preview for the next episode of Better Call Saul looks pretty cool. If you stayed around to watch the preview for the next episode, a lot of characters are previewed for the next episode. Some of the characters I managed to see during the montage were Tyrus, Victor, Nacho. Additionally, Crazy 8 is seen at the very end of the montage, so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens moving forward. I definitely think after an extremely heavy law episode, we're going to see more of the cartel and Mike Ehrmantraut in the next episode. But from the preview, it looks like it's going to be intermingled with Jimmy's plot developing as well. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. Please feel free to comment. I love to hear what other people are thinking about this season so far, as well as this episode. My name is Anton Jackson. I'm really looking forward to the episode next week, and thanks again for watching.